Well, thank you, Dean Allard and Judge Buckley and Ira Glasser. I know that their comments will have generated some questions. We have some students, I think, with mics. So if you have a question, we can call on you. And do we have mics? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, there's a question from Michael Grant, one of our distinguished alums.
Thank you. You all mentioned that the cost of the current campaign finance system has been greater inequality, has been more money in politics, and has been the very real risk of restricting speech and, if we went further, even banning books, right? If that is the case, then why do places like Canada, France, Britain have much less income inequality, have much less money in politics, and yet still seem to operate as democracies?
Well, Britain has an Official Secrets Act, you know, and these are not places where our First Amendment standards are what we would like them to be. They have hate speech codes. They don't have, you know, so I would not hold them up as a model for our First Amendment jurisprudence. But as to why we have so much more inequality, it isn't because of political campaigns. It's because of changes in the tax structure that happened since 1980. It's talk about keeping your eye on the right ball. If your aim is to deal with the gross increases in inequality and financial inequality in this country since 1980, you have to look to other factors than to campaign finance reform. You know, what to do about the inequality of speech at this point, your guess is as good as mine. Again, what Dean Allard said, first do no harm, is a very good operating principle here, because we may not be able to remedy the inequality of speech anytime soon, but I sure as hell don't want to give the government more power over my speech in the meantime. A, because that's not going to do it, and B, because it will create this other problem that we don't need. So I don't know enough about these other countries to know whether they are how their elections work or whether they are models that we want to follow. But I do know that there are things that could have been done along the way to have made it easier on insurgents. And the fact of the matter is that every piece of campaign finance legislation that Congress has ever passed since 1971, every piece has made it harder on insurgents and has advantaged incumbency, and incumbency has increased tremendously. And the Republicans and Democrats have joined together on this because they have the same interest, which is staying in office. I testified 30 times in Congress on this problem in the 70s and 80s, and people, including people like John McCain and Russ Feingold, were on the same side of being absolutely stonewalling when I said, well, why don't you just give candidates who get onto the ballot the franking privilege, so that they can communicate as easily with the constituents as you can. Your use of the franking privilege doesn't count against your campaign limits, but they have to buy time, and that does count against their limits. And you know, they didn't want that. You have to, the fox in the chicken coop is the right metaphor here. The people who pass these laws are interested in staying in office. And that is the function of requiring small gifts. Because if you can require big gifts, you can create insurgencies like Senator McCarthy's. If you require him to do this, now it's a little easier to do it now. Bernie Sanders has done it because of the internet, because of Twitter, because of text messaging, because it's a little bit easier to raise money in small amounts now, and it can happen. in a way that it couldn't happen 20, 30, 40 years ago. And that may turn out to be a remedy. I mean, look at the leading candidate on the Republican side in terms of money 8 months ago was Jeb Bush. Well, where has he gotten? Now, it is true that Trump has his own money, but this is what we've come to. The Supreme Court has ruled. Remember, the Supreme Court has ruled that equality cannot be the goal in First Amendment jurisprudence in the campaign finance area. It has to be corruption. And therefore, people like Donald Trump can spend all he wants, not even though it makes him unequal with less wealthy candidates, because the idea is, well, he can't corrupt himself. And Mayor Bloomberg can decide to run for president, and he can't corrupt himself either. But if I decide I want to try to run for president, and I can persuade George Soros to give me the same amount of money that Trump will spend or that Bloomberg would spend, he commits a crime. So, I don't know how these various systems work in other countries, but it's a little bit like saying, well, let it go with that.
Dean Allard?
So maybe a word about your question about money and the length of time of our campaigns. So the projection is that for this current campaign, $4.4 billion will be spent total for all candidates. That's a lot of money on television alone. So one of the things I was suggesting is, rather than getting enmeshed in these metaphysical debates which go on because of the framework set by Buckley v. Valeo, is speech money or not? Is it the corruption the problem, or is tyranny the problem? And so on and so forth. Let's really kind of analyze what's going on here. And so I would suggest that if you look at what the lion's share of all the money is raised for, then you can do a series of studies to really start to figure things out. Number one, is that effective? Has anybody actually studied the impact? Everybody assumes, oh, you gotta spend the money on those TV ads. I suggest that may once have been the case. I think it was overstated, but it's no longer the case, right? Also, people are shocked when they hear this. But right now, there is this insidious relationship where a senior campaign official who recommends media buys to his candidate gets back, the campaign pays an enormous check to the TV station, and they get back, the campaign official who recommended that buy gets back a check. In any other industry, that would be called a kickback, okay? And also, television and radio broadcast is regulated by the Federal Communications Commissions. If you were in Iowa right now, and if you were trying to sell pickup trucks, you cannot get airtime. Because of the way the rules work, all the prices go up and go down. And so I suggest that there may be, if you begin to look at some of these problems in a creative new way, you may be able to get some traction in addressing them. Now, your larger question about comparisons are very, very tricky. You're talking about parliamentary systems. You're talking about systems where they have statutory limitations on the length of campaigns. Wouldn't it be nice to announce an election and have a 5-week campaign? Wouldn't that be refreshing? And then everybody could go back to business and spend more time. But in the United States, unfortunately, we have the never-ending perpetual campaign, and that's the way our system works. I suspect that if you tried to limit the length of campaigns, that itself would run into First Amendment problems. So it's a very, very tricky problem. So what we should be doing is focusing on things that we can deal with.
If you have other questions? Yes, right over there.
For me, the biggest concern is the corruption that all this money brings about. What comes to mind immediately is Sheldon Adelson having an array of senators coming to visit him in Las Vegas, and then them going to the Senate and proposing a bill to eliminate internet gambling. Like, they had no dog in that fight, and they're basically auditioning to get his money. And the Supreme Court would say that's not corruption, but you can almost basically make a quid pro quo there, that they're getting this money so they can support bills that favor his positions. And my question is how do you eliminate that? Because even with an anonymous, unlimited donations that you could solicit for your actual campaign, this would still go on, and then nobody would know about it.
You have a response?
I didn't quite,
The question is, if Sheldon Adelson or some other large donor meets with a bunch of candidates and I guess promises them support, and then they go introduce a bill that favors his interests, isn't that corruption? And how do we propose dealing with that?
I'm not sure that there is any way of dealing with it. Human beings are human beings. I think there are ways of detecting honorable men in elective office and those that, with a pattern, show that they are in fact corrupt in the sense you suggest. And the best way to handle that is not to re-elect them. It's a tangential issue, but one thing that I became very concerned with as a result of my experience in the Senate was, once upon a time, it was a part-time job in the earlier days of the Republic. The Congress was in session 5-6 months of the year. The rest of the year you went home and you continued doing what you were. In recent times, it has become a career, and routinely, members of Congress will vote against their convictions, not because someone is offering them money, but for the simple reason that they don't want to get a skew of an important contingency. So I think that the real corruption, the effective corruption these days is not dollars, it is votes. And my solution for that I don't think is contrary to the First Amendment, is term limitations. And that unfortunately does require a constitutional amendment. But I don't think it's out of the question, because at one point, a substantial majority of states had the equivalent for their own jurisdictions. They had limits on who they could send to Congress. But the Supreme Court found that that was contrary to the Constitution because the states did not have a right to tell the federal government how it was to have its own people. But you do represent, you do express a real concern.
Yeah, I understand and embrace your question and the sentiment, which is certainly very widespread. There's too much damn money in the system. But I would say this, that I think that the court in Buckley made a mistake in making corruption exclusively the grounds justifying federal campaign laws and exclusive focus on corruption, because I think that red herring doesn't serve us well. First, there are, as Senator Buckley suggests, see, Joel calls him Judge Buckley, but coming from where I come, I recognize his higher calling in the United States Senate. Senator Buckley implies there are existing criminal laws and civil laws which apply to misfeasance, malfeasance, bribery, gratuities, conflict of interest. They apply. And those are regularly enforced in cases, and that's why we know about it, and that's one of the reasons. It's also the example of the exception proving the rule, you know. I will also tell you that my experience in government, working with great people like the people on this panel, the overwhelming number of women and men who go to public service are there for a purpose. They're not there to make money. They're not there to be corrupted. They're hardworking. And also, our system, I have such great faith in it. Even if they are corrupt, it's almost hard for them to screw up because it is so hard to get something done. There has to be a consensus. If you screw up and you pull a fast one and you slip something in a bill in the dead of night because improperly, well, you can count on the press or a colleague or an adversary to point that out. And one of the great lessons that my boss, Senator Kennedy, taught me when I screwed up, don't worry, Nick, anything that's done can be undone. And that's true. So we have this wonderful self-correcting system of government that works. We have women and men of good faith who are in government. The system is now broken and dysfunctional, so what we really need is to have clear-minded people who are very thoughtful and concerned, as you are, to figure out how best to get at it. And I would suggest, and I think I'm consistent with other members of the panel, corruption is an evil, no doubt it's an evil. But even if we corrected the corruption problem, it wouldn't solve the other issues.
I also would point out to you that what you described with respect to Adelson is exactly what Rupert Murdoch did in this city in the early 70s with respect to getting laws changed that allowed him to combine electronic media with print media. And he did so without ever making a contribution to anybody. You know why? Because he owned the Post. And he turned the Post into a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week blurb for Rudy Giuliani. And if somebody was running against Giuliani and got someone to buy a one-page ad on one day in the Post, they would commit a crime. But he got to do it for free because he owned a newspaper. And Adelson just bought a newspaper for that very reason. So, one of the interesting things is, with all of these restrictions on speech that are designed to avoid that problem, they don't apply to newspapers. Now, why not? What it means is, if the Times wants to editorialize every single day for or against a candidate, it has a First Amendment right to do so. But if somebody like Soros on the left or Adelson on the right wants to buy one page on one day to take the opposite point of view, they're not allowed to do it. And why is that? In First Amendment terms, there can't be any justification for it. So that kind of stuff, has always happened. But again, you have to focus on what the remedy is. The remedy cannot be a restriction on speech. And I've been saying for years, no, if George Soros doesn't like it, he can always buy a newspaper. And I said it tongue in cheek. Well, Adelson has just done that. Now suddenly he has a protection that he should have had all along. But so I just don't think you can address those problems through the mechanism of restrictions on speech through campaign finance laws. And while, you may call the speech is money, money is speech thing metaphysical, the fact is the court never said that money and speech were the same things. That was invented by people who were criticizing the court. And the way to think about that is, of course money and speech are two different things. Travel and money are two different things too. But if I told you that there was a constitutional, there was a legal restriction on, you can travel all you want, but you can't spend more than $100 on it, you would know right away that you can't get very far. And that somebody who had $25,000 could travel a lot further. You would understand the relationship between the right to travel and the right to spend money on travel. And the same thing is true of speech. The Times has always had a lot more speech than I do. They say what they want, and I have to beg them to get a letter published in 150 words, taking a different position. Well, that's, I don't know, what do you do about that except give the government the power to equalize speech? And when you give the government the power to equalize speech, remember who you're giving that power to. You may think you're giving it to you, or to me, or to people who think like you or me, but in evaluating how the government will use the power to equalize speech, you have to remember Think about your worst enemies and control of that power. Think of Nixon, think of Giuliani, think of Joe McCarthy. You know, think of those people and how they would use the power, because they're the ones who get to use it, not us. So that's what makes those kinds of remedies always very dangerous. So there has to be a solution to the inequality of speech, which I do think is a grave distortion on how democracy works in this country, and it's gotten worse, not better. But I don't think you can do it through the mechanism of campaign finance restrictions on speech, which A, because it doesn't solve the problem, and B, because it creates other problems besides.
Joel, if I could, I'd very quickly follow up.
Sure.
With 2 points. In terms of the resiliency and self-protection of what Senator Buckley described as the ballot box, elections is the ultimate safeguard. There's a wonderful saying that was attributed to both the incomparable Molly Ivins of Texas, a real sage, and also Senator Jesse Unruh of California. Now, I'm going to clean this up because there's so many young people in this audience. But it goes something like this. If you can't take their money, drink their booze, smoke their cigars, and here's where I'm cleaning it up, and dance with their women, and still vote against them in the morning, you don't deserve to be in the legislature, and you won't be for very long. So ultimately, assuming that there's transparency and sunlight and that you know what's going on, the ballot box is a powerful correcting. Now, the other thing I'll say is, as we have this dialogue, which has been so brilliantly started today, and we're building to the 26th on our free speech symposium with our impresario, Professor Gorer, cracking the whip, I really hope that we focus and are forward-looking, because in so many areas of the law and public policy, we're addressing solutions to yesterday's problems, right? And it's either too late or things have moved on. And so, for example, the primary driver of fundraising is broadcast television. And you know, in this country, we went from a place where no one campaigned to the front porch to newspaper whistle-stop campaigning. Then the radio. Calvin Coolidge actually was the most effective guy in the radio, because he said so little compared to those other loudmouths that it actually worked well on TV. And then, of course, FDR was on TV, on radio so powerfully and so on. And then JFK, television. That was the birth of the TV era. We are now at the end of the TV era. We're now in an era where, because of scale and people's knowledge on how to use new media, so this is providing both new opportunities and ways to campaign, new opportunities on how to raise money. So we're going to have, every age we have problems, but they shift. So let's not develop a cure for broadcast television-driven fundraising when you can now raise 10 million $2 contributions, and we still have problems in our elective system. So what I'm suggesting simply is we should be forward-looking and address problems as they will be tomorrow, and not just fix things that addressed us yesterday, and by imposing outdated rules have unintended negative consequences which are actually harmful to the system.
Well, that strikes me as a wonderful note upon which to end the program, and to thank our speakers for a remarkable presentation. Just remarkable.